I'll start this up for recording for the web. Okay, so people ask me a lot of times when they're starting out neurofeedback, even if they've been in it for a while, who needs coherence? I mean, why are we doing it? It doesn't really tell us anything, which would probably set Robert Thatcher and a lot of other people's hair on fire to begin with, since they are the key experts on this topic, and they devoted their lives to understanding it and researching it. So it's a very valuable technology, a very valuable tool in neurometrics. The problem with it is that there's just so much we still have to know and understand about it. And applying it clinically has been a little sketchy because there just hasn't been enough research on it. You know, we need a lot more research. And there's some great stuff being out there. And again, Thatcher takes the lead on most of this stuff. But there's a lot of other people in neuroimaging who are looking at coherence. And there's many ideas about what its value is. So what I want to do is just explore basically what it is, how you might use it in terms of QEEG brain mapping for purposes of neurofeedback, not for medical diagnosis, and what it can bring to the table when you look at a map in terms of added information, added value. Okay, so let's start off with what is coherence, the toughest question. So here we have three different explanations from simple to more complex that might help, but you'll see that it still can leave you pretty foggy, particularly if you're not familiar with these concepts. So the mathematical measure of the degree of similarity of the EEG recorded at two sensors, coherence ranges from 0 to 1. If the phase, which is the EEG rising and falling of the two signals, are more similar over time, then it suggests functional connectivity, that those two areas of the brain are working together. So that's a very simple explanation. A little more sophisticated, EEG coherence, defined as the normalized cross-power spectrum per frequency of two signals recorded simultaneously at different sites of the scalp, is a sensitive method for assessing the integrity of structural connection between brain areas. And that's helpful because it gives us an idea of, well, what might you do with this? Look at the integrity of the structural connectivity between the brain areas. And that's really the key. Thatcher gets into a little more detail. Coherence is a measure of the amount of association or coupling between two different time series. Time series is just tracking something over time. Coherence combines something analogous to the Pearson product moment correlation, which you all just know as basically correlation if you're not statistically well trained, with the additional information of a cross-correlation function of phase angle between two signals at different frequencies. And that concept, a cross-correlation function of phase angles between two signals, is very important. It's particularly important to Robert Thatcher, who sees this as a critical component that distinguishes his method of computing coherence as being the best and most accurate, for purposes intended. And there's a fair amount of support for that concept, but it's not exclusively correct. When the phase difference between two signals is constant, then coherence equals 1. When the phase difference between signals is random, then coherence is 0. So there's some ideas. How is it calculated? Okay, so here is one mathematical notation set explaining coherence. The relationship, if you looked at a little bit lower, is the relationship between the cross spectrum with the auto spectrum. And for most of you, you'll say, what does that mean? Well, to get into that would take us a whole hour, and we still would barely dent it. So the best way to look at this, for people who aren't really into the mathematical side of it, is that we're roughly looking at the correlation of the phase relationship between two different signals. Okay, And we're going to kind of fill that concept out here in a second. So we can calculate coherence by various methods and get various results, and that has actually been done in the field of neurofeedback over the years. And there has been continual disagreement between different players, all of them mathematically very sophisticated players, about which coherence method is best or most useful with respect to assessment and neurofeedback. And that discussion is still an open discussion in the field of neuroimaging. But you'll find that there's one method that tends to be used more than others, and that's Welch's average periodogram method, which is what we use at NewMind. And I believe that's what Thatcher uses. I'm not completely clear on that, but based on what he's written, it looks like that. I know that's what Thought Technology uses. So a lot of the other software developers use it because it's very commonly used in research, and it's on all of the mathematical platforms as an easily accessible methodology. Prior to that, the lexicor method was used, which is a non-phase method, which does look at the correlation between amplitudes of two location, and it's similar to Kaiser-Sturman's correlation of magnitude co-modulation, which is a non-phase method. So those two-phase methods, non-phase methods, sorry, Kaiser-Sturman and lexicor, just look mostly at the covariation of power or amplitude between two locations. So is there a Pearson correlation between these two locations? You know, is the amplitude correlating, and how much, and at what rate? So let's look at phase relationships and try to understand a little bit better what Welch's method is, and why Thatcher is so concerned about phase relationship. Here is an EEG at C3 and an EEG at C4, and you can see that it's varying in amplitude, or power, if you will, depending on your unit of measure. And when you compare the two, you get a visual image that looks kind of like the picture here at the bottom. So this is a time series, activity occurring over time, and you're seeing the amplitude shifting up and down, right, between C3 and C4, but you notice that there's a slight difference in the timing. And so the difference between the two defines what we call the phase relationship. So we're not just saying, are these covariant? We're saying, to what degree are they covariant with respect to phase? So let's dig a little deeper on the concept of phase, because that's fundamental to the understanding of coherence. So here we have that same thing where we have two locations going up and down in amplitude at slightly different times, and you can use a method to calculate the phase difference between them, and it's usually computed in degrees. So you have phase lead, where one, the blue, leads the red in time, and then you have phase lag, where the red lags the blue in time. And so we calculate that with degrees. That's just a standard mathematical procedure for comparison purposes. There's also something called phase lock and phase reset, which you should be aware of because it's becoming discussed more and more in neurofeedback, and will be in the future, no doubt. Phase lock refers to the change in state between two or more locations in which the phase angle of all locations remains similar and consistent for a period of 500 milliseconds or more. That's actually what coherence is, and I'll get into that in a minute. But phase locking is that you have one nerve firing at this one rate. You can see it's going up and down, and then you have another nerve firing at another rate, and by nerve we mean a neuron. And you can see that there is, even though they're at different frequencies, they're matching up, the peaks are matching up to some degree. In this case, they're matching up perfectly, which would make them phase synchronous. There'd be zero phase lag because they're perfectly matched up. But, they're at different times because one is occurring slower than the other. But that would be a phase lock. So they may match up for that time period for a while, but then they may drift. When they drift, okay, they're resetting. And then they may lock up again. Okay, so you have this constant relationship between two locations where the relationship is kind of in a floating state, and other times they're locked together in timing. And this is how we think that networks connect and disconnect with each other, and they do it constantly, all the time, to communicate. So your coherence is about the consistent relationship of phase over time. If these two locations hold that 90-degree relationship consistently for 500 milliseconds or so, typically we say that they're coherent. So we like to look at how much coherence is occurring. Now, what are the functional implications of coherence? Well, we just said that, number one, it's a way of networks communicating, groups of neurons. But too much coherence usually results in a lack of functional differentiation. In other words, that they're talking too much and they're not talking with other networks or neuronal ensembles enough. We want everybody talking and communicating, but not too much. Too little coherence, which in our map system looks blue, results in a lack of functional coordination. So those two areas are in that kind of that phase reset period on a ongoing basis. They are not locking up very often, so you're not getting much communication. Now, when we measure phase, we have some issues that we have to contend with to get an accurate measurement of it. And one of the problems that distorts our measurement of phase and coherence is volume conduction. So volume conduction is the movement of electrical information throughout the brain, almost like the cloud we have on the internet. There's a constant kind of cacophony of information that is just moving randomly through the brain all the time from general diffuse electrical activity. Now, over short to moderate interelectrode distances, less than 8 to 10 centimeters, we can expect significant amounts of that information to be overlapping. So when you put two sensors close together, you're getting information of overlapping volume conduction activity because the generators are close together. And that artificially inflates the coherence by 30 to 40%. So if we're going to measure coherence accurately, we have a problem if those locations are less than 8 centimeters distant. So the closer you have two locations like O1 and T5 or T4 and F7, those are pretty close together. If you went from CZ to C3, that would be even closer together. So when you get those really close connections, you're getting an inflation of coherence. It's going higher than it actually is in reality because of the volume conduction involved. And so this is from Nunez's book, and he's showing how in X times 1, and X is in the back of the head, and then 1. That's kind of like a location O1 and something close to T5. You can see that there's a lot of inflated coherence, but that as you move more distant to location 3, 4, 5, and 6, okay, the inflation of the coherence drops down until we get to a more normal range in the higher numbers at the longer distances. And that's why in new mind maps, we don't look a lot at the shorter interelectrode distances, because there's not a lot of confidence in how accurate that is. Now, if you're using some of the techniques developed through Loretta by Pasquale Marquis, they look at ways of reducing that artificial coherence, which appear to be pretty effective, but that's beyond the scope of our discussion here. Coherence is dipole layer based. Coherence is based on the output from broad dipole layers. So it's large groups of neurons. You hear us saying, well, you have to have 60 million neurons in order to capture a signal at the scalp that are kind of working together, at the same time. So you're collecting information when you're looking at coherence on the maps that we do, any of the databases for that fact, of large dipole layers. You're not getting really communication between very small areas of the brain, but you're getting between large dipole layers. And there may be several dipole layers, that have 60 million neurons within the area of a Brodmann area. So a Brodmann area, if you're recording from one Brodmann area to the other, you have to make sure you're at the same location within that Brodmann area. Be fairly accurate about the dipole layers that you're, that you're measuring. Are you measuring the ones you think you're measuring? Laplacian analysis, which uses weighted average, and that's a method of really kind of honing in on exactly what's happening at a location in the brain. It's a statistical method that can give you more accuracy about what is communicating from one location to another in the brain. As we said, electrodes separated by less than 10, maybe 8, more conservative, are averaging over many of the same sources. Scalp potentials can be used primarily only to investigate source coherence between widely separated electrodes over large source regions. And that's straight out of Nunez, who's one of the leading experts on neurophysics. And again, he's saying, the longer your distance, the more accurate and effective your information is. And that's why, one of the reasons, for clinical purposes, not research purposes, but for clinical purposes, I prefer to use longer coherence runs. Now, you can only get so much length of a run out of interhemispheric coherence. So the question is also asked, well, why do we use primarily interhemispheric coherence? And I'll talk about that soon. When we're looking at coherence, we also have to look at it from two perspectives, from functional connectivity and effective connectivity. So functional connectivity says two neural elements have a functional connection if they have a statistically significant correlated activity without reference to how that correlation is mediated. So basically you're saying, okay, you have two locations, and we're looking at something like the Pearson product moment correlation of some form, some kind of correlation between two locations, and you're saying that, okay, we have some kind of connectivity, but we don't know the nature of it, and we don't know if there's another mediating influence. So we don't know the direction, how's information flowing from C3 to C4 or C4 to C3. We don't know whether it applies only to task and resting states. In task-dependent functional connectivity, the focus is on whether there's a change in the functional connection between regions as task demands. In resting state functional connectivity, the focus is on the overall pattern of functional connectivity and its relationship to underlying anatomy. So when we're looking at the functional connectivity, we're saying there is connectivity, and are the underlying regions working? Are they talking together reasonably? And that's what we're seeing in our mapping system and in most of the other mapping systems. They're just saying these areas are communicating. Are they communicating too much? You're getting a lot of red lines. Are they communicating too little? A lot of blue lines. Are we getting too much ongoing connectivity? It's not resetting, or is it resetting constantly too much? Now, the effective connectivity is different in that it shows the influence of one location on another. So we can start to look at directional influences and estimate that. And then you can start to look at difference between top-down and bottom-up effects. What's the communication level between cortical processes, within the cortex and between limbic structures and down deeper in the brain. And you can begin to look at the dependence of one region on another as well. So why is it that we want to talk about functional connectivity and effective connectivity? Well, until Coben started using his model of training with coherence, we weren't really including effective connectivity very efficiently in terms of coherence training in neurofeedback. The other reason is that when we're doing a brain map, we're mostly looking at functional connectivity. And we're not looking at effective connectivity. The other thing that we should think about when we're talking about connectivity in the brain is how are locations connected. There are hubs in the brain that are more important than other hubs and other nodes. These are convergence points. They're like cities on your map. If you're looking at roads or airline routes, you can see that there are key cities like Atlanta, where everything comes together from all of the different air pathways around the world. It's a major hub. In kind of a regular setup where every location is connected to every location, as if Atlanta was connected to every city in the world, you would have very complex, bulky traffic to manage. It'd be overwhelming. And if it was occurring in the human brain, you'd have to have a brain 3 or 4 times the size that you would have, which would be very difficult to carry around. In random connections, there are flight paths to some cities, but not to others, and you might get stranded or not get to where you want to get going. If you were carrying a message, you could end up not getting that message there. In small world connectivity, that's closer to what we see in the internet and into air flight. We have strategically designed connections where some hubs like Atlanta, New York, maybe Dulles Airport, those areas are more connected internationally than in other areas, and then you have to go to different nodes, maybe New Mexico or some other airport in Indianapolis or something, and then connect up with another airport to get where you're going. But typically, people flying internationally will fly into Delta or Los Angeles or Dulles, and then they'll fly out to some smaller airport like in New Mexico or down in Arizona. So there's an advantage in terms of efficiency and information management and simplicity of doing small world design. Now, within the small world design of networks with hubs and nodes, we have pathways. Now, on the left side, there's something that looks like an electronic schematic, and it's very detailed, and it's extremely complex. And what you're looking at is the connection of the visual cortex at the bottom and the back, and the rest of the brain. I mean, if you look at the amount of wiring and connectivity, it's profound. And for every line here, there's probably thousands or hundreds of thousands of fibers. On the right is maybe kind of a more standard pattern you'll see in brain maps, where they're looking at coherence connecting every which way. And you can see that this is very crude in terms of what it's measuring compared to the complexity and the fineness of what's on the left. So we need to keep in mind that when we're measuring with brain maps, we're making very crude estimates of connections between very large regions in the cortex, dipole layers, that are working together to provide information. This is not a really refined, detailed indicator. It's a very gross indicator of function. And a lot of people don't get that when they're looking at maps. It's just something that we naturally do when we look at things like this, to assume that it's showing us the true complexity when it's not. And then you can see that there's connections between a lot of short and longer locations, and the longer locations are going to give us more reliable numbers. Now let's look at working memory networks and the complexity of those. Here's a picture of the working memory network on the left and the right. The first thing that you can see is that there's more than 19 locations here. So if you're doing connectivity on a brain map, you're not capturing all of the locations just in working memory alone. And if you look at how these are located, a lot of them are outside the 1020 system. They're in between in a lot of areas. So a lot of the researchers use much denser arrays of sensors to record. So they'll use caps with very dense sensor arrays. But then we have the problem is that they start picking up overlapping dipole information. So they have to try to use all these mathematical techniques to filter out the volume conduction and get what's really going on between those locations. It's a lot of work. Its accuracy is always in question. But just using a standard neurofeedback mapping system and thinking that you're going to get the subtleties of the working memory network, I think it's not justified. And if you say, well, you're going to train the working memory network, well, which part? And which part overlaps the 1020 system that you're training? And is that a hub or a node in the working memory network? And is that hub or node really going to do the job to sort out the problem you have when it could be in all these different locations? I think if you start thinking of all those questions, you start to see the problems with training coherence with specificity to correct a problem in a particular network. I don't think we're quite there technologically yet. And that could be debated quite a bit at any given conference. Okay, so not all locations are created equally. We have rich club networks, these major hubs, and we have smaller networks. And the rich club network do manage 77% of communication. And good news is that a lot of the rich club network hubs match up fairly close with the 1020 system. So that's why you might be able to argue that you could make a pretty good impact on these networks like the working memory network. Till we have a lot more research, we won't know. So it's pretty experimental to be doing this. Here's the salience network. You can see again how complex it is, and it's not all matching the 1020. Same thing with executive control, although that's much closer because the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is kind of F3, F4, and dorsolateral parietal cortex is very close to P3, P4, anatomically. Let's look at coherence and communication. If coherence is meant as a communication method within the brain, you can see here's a pre-neurofeedback magnitude map and then a post-neurofeedback magnitude map. And this is pretty impressive because this is pretty low power in alpha and beta, and they got this power normalized with neurofeedback, which is rare but very cool. The other thing to note is since they normalized that, really what happened is the power increased across the board. And now we have a new picture, which is that delta and theta are actually higher in amplitude, and we increase the power in alpha, beta, and high beta, but we still have problems in delta and theta, which were there in the pre, and if we had shifted up with our shift, you would have seen something similar to this at the bottom. So here we have pre and post map. Now look at the coherence. This looks almost like autism here. We've just got so many coherence problems. It's hypercoherent all the way through. So there's too much communication. This is a brain that's distressed, that's trying desperately to communicate within networks to maintain function. Then if you look at the post-coherence, you can see, look at all those green areas. So you can see that as the brain normalizes, that desperate communication ceases and we get more normal function. Although you notice here in the beta frequencies, we've got a lack of communication, which is probably just a general reflection of what's going on. There's too much inflammation with all that delta. Coherence is an adaptive response to trauma. It's adaptive and compensatory, and I've often shown this from an article by Alstott in 2009, where he's modeling lesions in the brain and then looking at how the brain responds. And if you look at this section B in the middle image here, you can see there's a little green cross on this left side here, and that's where the proposed lesion is. And you can see that within the left hemisphere, intrahemispherically, the communication has diminished. And that would make sense because that area has to shut down for repairs. In the meantime, the right hemisphere has increased in communication, and that is an adaptive response. That's why I say coherence is an adaptive response. That's an increased communication between hemispheres, and it's, in a sense, invading the left hemisphere and taking over to support function there, to take over function for the area that's shut down and recovering. And that's kind of a general perspective that is highly endorsed in the neuroimaging field at this point. And that's why looking at interhemispheric coherence is so valuable, and we know a lot more about it and so critical, especially at the clinical level. So trauma reduces plasticity and function and increases coherence. So we can see the interconnectivity here. And then we can look at the interconnectivity down here, and we can see that this is significant changes in coherence, and that's after the head trauma. So this is before head trauma at the top, and the bottom's after head trauma at the top. And you can see, particularly in beta, after the head trauma, there was increased communication in the posterior region, probably to cope with sensory processing deficits from the head trauma, to make up for that, and that we had lost some communication in the temporal lobe, which is very typical with head trauma, and that processing had been reduced in that area. So that can be something of value to note. So we'll have to look at another map to get a better idea. This here's Parkinson's, and this shows you coherence is compensatory as well with respect to degenerative processes in the brain. You notice that the delta and the theta are quite high, which is very common in Parkinson's, and beta is very low because you're losing high energy processing abilities. You're losing mitochondrial energy output because you have so much inflammatory process, which you can see in that elevated delta, and reduced perfusion in the theta. And you can see there's a slowing in the alpha, which is common with this kind of issue. But notice the connectivity. Now, you're losing connective function. The brain is wandering. It's not linking up between locations enough and communicating enough. So it's kind of in a free fall. The phase is constantly shifting, but the locations aren't linking up. But you can see that there's a desperate effort in delta and theta to maintain the linkage in that functional area, because that's very primitive functions that is hanging on to. We've lost higher level functions to some degree. But it also shows you, the accuracy of the Neumann system and its ability to show that coherence is reflecting function in terms of loss of high energy abilities in the brain, that the magnitude and the coherence connect up, and that the magnitude is accurately reflecting this physiological process. So it's a testimony to the validity of the system. Here we have hypocoherence in artifact. One of the things that occurs in artifact, FP1, FP2, this is artifact we're seeing here. It's beta artifact. One of the giveaways, as we always say, is that the high beta is elevated, and so we're getting leakage into the low beta, and we know this is artifact. But there's another way to tell that it's artifact, and that we see the high beta and the beta are hypocoherent. It was Bob Thatcher that first tuned me into this, and I was when I started looking at all the maps, I noticed that that was in fact the case, and so we use that as part of our calculation system to determine whether we're looking at artifact or not. So here's an artifact, and this is in fact a NeuroGuide, and if you look down here, here's the hypocoherence. That is a function of this artifact. So when you have beta artifact, it destroys the coherence, just obliterates the validity of it. And that's why we really like to get beta information, record the beta frequencies with as little muscle tension as we can. But it's so subtle. Once you get over 21 hertz, if you read Witham's research, your coherence is starting to degrade. The quality of it's not going to be very good. So I would be very suspicious of any coherence evaluations you're getting from a map in high beta. Functional interhemispheric connectivity, low power and low coherence. Low coherence is a reliable measure of the integrity of neuronal fibers, especially the functional interhemispheric connectivity, especially, he noted. The functional interhemispheric connectivity measure also provides a measure of midbrain, pons, and cerebellar integration. That is good news for us because that means coherence is a window into functional connectivity between cortical and subcortical structures. And interestingly enough, Dipole notes that alpha coherence is especially useful for that. So when you're looking at alpha coherence, notice if you're getting a lot of blue. If you are, you're losing connectivity in the alpha. You're losing connectivity between cortical and subcortical processing. So it's a good proxy measure of subcortical integration. With that in mind, if you look at somebody with brainstem trauma, which I have here, okay, and I'm processing this through a NeuroGuide and then putting it through our report system so that we get we don't get any arguments on this. If you look at the connectivity in delta and the connectivity, you can see that the loss of function here is reflected in the hypocoherence here. So low delta is often related with a loss of functional connectivity in the brain, and Alper et al. Noted that particularly in their research on crack cocaine users who tended to show a lot of low delta and loss of connectivity and functionality. You'll notice that this also results in a lack of functionality and connectivity in theta and alpha, so we'd lose memory processing. And here we have that alpha low coherence. What does it mean? It means that we're lacking interconnectivity between the cortex and the lower structures, limbic function and below. And then we can see the impact on posterior beta, and we know that that's related to sensory integration, which we'll show you later. So interhemispheric coherence, subcortical centers modulate interhemispheric coherence. Dipole notes that interhemispheric coherence depends on the integrity of intracortical and subcortical fiber systems, indicating that interhemispheric coherence is also a proxy measure of intrahemispheric integrity. And you'll see that pretty consistently with inter is out, the intra is out. So to make things simple, for clinicians, we focus mostly on longer distance interhemispheric connectivity for many of these reasons. But if you want the intra, you can get it in other databases. It increases the complexity of your assessment quite a bit. Often can be burdensome at the clinical level. So the interhemispheric networks dominate, and as we say, there seems to be more interhemispheric dominant networks than intrahemispheric dominants. And that's been noted in lots of publications. It is the most crucial thing to look at is interhemispheric. Coherence and mild cognitive impairment. Again, we see a similar pattern in mild cognitive impairment here. This is getting into problems again with delta and theta, which shows up in cognitive decline, head trauma, Parkinson's, and again, the loss of high frequency. And you can see that same pattern here, the global beta hypocoherence. When you see elevated delta and theta and global beta hypocoherence, as Dipole says, you're losing a lot of connectivity both intrahemispherically, intra-hemispherically, and cortically and subcortically. That's a bad sign when you see this happening in your map. So let's look at computerized performance tests in the NuMind system, which are normed tests, and their relationship with mapping. And this is something you can do if you have that system. Now, I'm looking at intra. You can't do that in our system at present. You will be able to do it in a few months if you use the Brain DX component of our system. But again, we're looking at the intra here, and you can see how off this all is intrahemispherically and how much that's related to spatial sorting and filtering. It's affecting list acquisition because it's affecting connection between parietal and dorsolateral areas, and that's always an indicator, but you can see that in the inter just as easily. At any rate, you see a lot of the spatial processing difficulties in intra. It tends to show up more parietally in the inter. So, and here's a case in point. If we look at sensory integration, again, you can see filtering is a major issue here. And you can see that the beta hypercoherence is very prominent here. When we ran statistical analysis, we found that 70% of the people with this pattern reported serious hypercoherence problems. And when you start to look at underreporting, because they don't know what sensory processing issues are, it goes up in significance much higher. So look for beta posterior hypercoherence. That usually indicates sensory integration problems. And you can see that again here, that same issue, and it's showing up spatial sorting problems and filtering problems. So again, that shows you how hypercoherence in beta tells you that there's spatial sorting problems and filtering problems. Particularly F7 and F8 is filtering information, probably coming through the insonant vesicular ventral pathways into the frontal and prefrontal regions of the brain. And that's, again, showing up here. And you see list acquisition is once again a problem. So list acquisition is one of the first things to go when you have head trauma or problems in the brain, and it's one of the key correlates with academic performance as well. So we can see coherence and shifting of task, flexibility are related. If you have a lot of alpha coherence, you can see that there's a lot of compensatory coherence typically at the same time. And when these two occur, if you look at a questionnaire, which we have in our system, saying, do you have problems with multitasking or shifting tasks, you'll see there's a significantly correlated relationship between elevated alpha and alpha coherence and difficulty shifting task, which often means they're also uncomfortable shifting from one situation to another. What about training coherence? Well, Joe Horvath and Dr. Walker down in Texas pretty much pioneered coherence training, and they were using the Lexicor coherence mostly to do it, as far as I know. Lexicor, as you know, is not the phase coherence that Thatcher uses, and Brainmaster has adapted phase coherence, although you can get the Lexicor coherence in Brainmaster as well. So you have a choice there. You can use either one, but a lot of this was done, I think, with the Lexicor types of coherence calculations. And a lot of this early training was. Now, Walker did power training first, and Horvath did coherence training first, and he put this in the Handbook of Neurofeedback by Evans which you can read the full chapter in if you want. Rob Longo has done quite a bit of work with this, but he's using our Welsh method, so he's using phase, the more phase related coherence calculations for his work. And what he found seemed to match up with what Joe found a lot. First of all, Joe said never uptrain delta coherence. Well, if you're doing Z-score training, you are uptraining delta coherence. And people were doing it when Z-score came in and they were getting away with it. Well, the reason they were getting away with it is because they were training power at the same time. So if you train coherence up in delta, you should probably train power up in delta. But we don't have a whole lot of research on this. We need a lot more. And you may have noticed an article written by Coben and Hammond and others, saying, we just don't have a lot of good, solid research on Z-score training. It seems to work. And in this case, it seems to work pretty good if you're uptraining delta coherence, but we're not getting enough solid research on it to, want to feel comfortable freely using it with your clients without being overly concerned. So Horvath just never did that. He usually trained coherence down. He was usually looking at hypercoherence. He saw hypercoherence as one of the biggest issues usually in head trauma and other areas. And you'll see that is the case typically. You tend to see more of the hyper than the hypo, because hypo means the brain's kind of given up. So he would train delta coherence down first, and then he would tend to go after theta coherence and train that down. And then next, he might reduce beta coherence or increase beta coherence if necessary. So he was aware that hypocoherence in beta was an issue. I don't think he knew about all the research because type L came out after he passed, so 2009. So he may not have been around to see that, but he sensed it and he saw it and he did that himself. And he had pretty good success with this, but there's always a danger of side effects. And that's why he was very careful with it. So overtraining was a common pitfall. He felt that if he trained more than 10 or 12 sessions without remapping, he would find that he trained coherence too much in the other direction. Well, now we know that may not have been true. It just may be that he was seeing an adaptive response in coherence as the brain reorganized. But back in the day, we didn't really appreciate the complexity of what we were doing. And a lot of people were treating the brain as if it was just a passive device responding to input, and it's not. It can significantly increase symptomology. You need to be careful. I've trained people with Z-score, and their symptoms increase. In particular, I had one person who had seizure, and that increased their seizure rate. And we controlled for everything else, and so we just stopped doing it. It was too much of a risk. So I tend to only use standard neurofeedback, SMR, based on various research for that seizure activity training. And then there's significant side effects that can occur, and they vary endlessly. We know that training magnitude changes coherence fairly rapidly. If you put a photostimulation device on somebody and you have low alpha magnitude, with a little bit of coherence, and the magnitude normalizes, you can see, look at the communication in alpha. So that's one of the ways you can see that it's really adaptive response. Within 20 seconds of turning it on, you'll see the low alpha normalize, and you'll see what the brain does to normalize that low alpha. It increases coherence. So beware that when you're looking at pre-post maps, if you normalize magnitude, you may see increased coherence in the map. It doesn't mean the person got worse because their coherence increased. It means it was an adaptive response. And this is what we're always trying to get across, and it's so agonizingly difficult to embrace with mapping, is that it's not a linear process, that the map goes through many combinations and permutations on its journey to a more normal pattern. And it's very hard to see that long-term trend. We tend to get lost in the details at each mapping that, oh no, this kind of looked like it went in a negative direction. It isn't. The brain is much more resilient than that. And you're doing neurofeedback. You're not hitting it up with a drug. Finally, I'd like to address Coben's QPS coherence protocol. This is probably one of the more exciting advances in neurofeedback that I've seen that's really well researched, really supported by research that's been very well done. Rob Coben is an excellent scientist, and he does excellent presentations. If you ever get a chance to see him, you should. And he's actually developed a coherence training method that includes effective connectivity. So he did research where he actually looked at 2-channel coherence training and 4-channel coherence training, and that's at Coben et al. 2018. You can get it on the internet just by putting that in. And he found that it enhances spatial acuity and reduces error by 50%. So 50% improvement over 2-channel coherence training. We haven't seen that with amplitude, but we've seen it with coherence. But with his particular type of coherence training, and the reason I say he's including effective connectivity is because he's not just looking at the relationship between B and C and A and D, like F3, F4, and P3, P4. He's looking at all combinations and permutations of possible connections between those 4 locations. And when you look at those combinations and permutations, here they are. And what he does is he adds them up and divides, and so he gets an average. So what he's really doing is he is training the effective connectivity between these locations. And that's a new thing, really. Now, you could probably reconfigure your Z-score software to do that. I'm not sure the details, but if you ask some of these people like Dick, who just spends endless hours, he's a super geek, just playing with all of these high-end softwares and trying to get different combinations with them and programming the Brainmaster's wizard. He can do this kind of stuff, and if you're interested in doing this stuff with his help, you can. It's my understanding, however, that Brainmaster and a lot of the other companies, including us, are building screens to use Rob Coben's coherence protocol, because it's pretty impressive. So that's where I'm going to end up for today on that. And I know we don't have time for questions, but we have many more Lunch and Learns coming up. And if you have questions about this, you can write them down and send them to Rob and me. And if this went by too fast, this will be posted in a day or two. You can go up on the New Mind YouTube channel and review it again and write up some questions, or rediscover that area where you had the question and send it to us, and we'll be happy to discuss it with you.
Great. Hey, thank you, Richard. Yeah.